we are Vietnamese. We don't fight with anyone. We just protect our country. Like we protect our independence and our freedom if necessary, but we don't fight. And also, I want to emphasize the first day we go to school as a 6-year-old child, the first thing we were taught is nothing is as important as our country independence and freedom.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Join us at the Startup Conference Echelon X. Engage with over 10,000 of Asia's innovators and decision makers on May 15 and 16 at the Singapore Expo. We have 30 exclusive complimentary tickets for our podcast listeners. Sign up and use the promo codes BravePod or ECXJeremy to claim your free tickets now. Hey Valerie, good to have you back on the show.
Hi, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Good. Your last episode was very popular, talking about the $12 billion fraud case for the Saigon Bank and death penalty. So figured we'll do some sequel updates since there have been some developments since that conversation.
Yeah, so the most recent update is she has a death penalty sentence, and the banks are now forced to close a lot of branches. So recently, there are more than 50 branch of Saigon SCB Bank being shut down. But at the same time, the State Bank of Vietnam, which is the central bank of Vietnam, guarantees that they will not allow a bank run happening in Vietnam. So they guarantee that they will have a bailout package to save SCB. So that's the latest update. There's not much of a new updates from the death sentence announcement.
Yeah, so let's talk about the death sentence first, and after we'll talk about the bailout. So
Yeah.
on the first part of the death sentence, I heard that there is an appeals process that's undergoing, but I don't think
Yep.
it'll be a very long appeals process. How long does that roughly take?
I'm not a lawyer myself, but yeah, she can appeal, and she's allowing her daughters to start selling the asset to foreign investors, mainly real estate, and especially very valuable commercial real estate pieces in the city, both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. And there are actually a lot of buyer interest in those properties. So yeah, all of that for assisting her in the appeal and the bailout process as well.
So yeah, I think what'll be interesting is just like how much those assets are, because obviously as property is very illiquid, it takes a long time to sell, and then some of them were half constructed, some of them are up and running. So let's see what the total value of that return is going to be as well. So assuming that the appeal doesn't succeed, the dark question, but is Vietnamese death penalty by hanging or shooting, or what? How does that work in Vietnam? In Singapore, it's hanging.
Jeremy, this is a tough question. I don't know myself.
Okay, we're gonna have to flash this up on the screen to figure out what the approach
Yeah.
is. And what's interesting is that there's a big rescue as well. It was about $12 to $13 billion of fraud, but the recent bailout was about $24 billion. And what's interesting is that the Vietnamese forex reserves in the central bank was about $100 billion. So this is about a quarter of the forex reserves going to the current rescue effort, which is a lot actually, if you think about it. I mean, a quarter of your forex reserves is a lot. But it's also interesting because you're saying that they are not necessarily promising that they'll do the next rescue if it gets worse.
Yeah. But fundamentally, financial stability is the most important factor for State Bank of Vietnam. And they have been really communicating with the financial professional that they are doing everything to save Vietnam from a bank failure. It has a large effect to the entire economy. So we are watching for what's coming next.
Yeah. No easy answer, because the lessons from America pretty much is the one thing worse than bailing a bank out, and obviously all the moral hazard it causes and the headlines and everybody hates you for saving a bank. The one thing worse than that is having to save multiple banks because you let the first one go. Because if you let one collapse, then other people are linked to it and there'll be more bankruptcy. So it's like a tough situation. Is this the first time that this has ever happened in Vietnamese history?
Nope.
And
It's definitely not the first time. There were very similar story in the past, and the State Bank of Vietnam always stepped in to protect the financial stability of the country. So it's not the first event in the banking history of Vietnam. And most of the previous scenario or event will happen quite recently in the past 10 years, because as you know, Vietnam was only open to the world, and their financial system are still really quite young compared to other neighboring country or compared to the global financial system. So we did have a similar incident in the past, and either the bank would merge with another bank or were rescued by State Bank of Vietnam.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. So not the first wave
Yeah.
and probably not the last, unfortunately. I mean, banks have this
Yeah.
habit of becoming too liquid or becoming too leveraged and I'm having to be
Yeah.
rescued.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting to see some of that turmoil. And we also previously discussed that one of the ripple effects of that has been the Blazing Furnace corruption campaign and how there have been multiple political departures. And you wanted to share that there was a new development.
Yeah, if you remember in the past episode, I mentioned that the president resigned back in March. Recently, a few days ago, our chairman of National Assembly also resigned. This position are the top four most important politicians in the Politburo in Vietnam. And usually or normally they would be the untouched position. But recently we learned in the past few months that there's nothing as untouched. So recently his name is Vương Định Huệ, and he recently resigned. And following his resignation, the National Assembly just made another emergency meeting, which is very unusual, to talk about what are the future leadership will be for the Communist Party of Vietnam. Because right now, two most important positions in the Politburo just resigned in the span of 2 months.
Yeah, the tricky part for these type of political systems is that the succession is very much a matter of negotiation internally. So quite opaque from the outside. So hopefully that gets sorted out.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that we continue to see news of investments flowing into Vietnam. Doesn't seem to have slowed or stopped down. Maybe we'll see that change in time to come. But Apple just recently announced its expansion in Vietnam.
Yeah, I want to emphasize like the changing in the political leadership does not affect the overall policy of welcoming foreign direct investment and foreign investor to come into Vietnam. And that's why Tim Cook last April, he actually visited Vietnam. It's a Southeast Asia trip that he was doing. He also visited Indonesia and met with leadership in Indonesia. But when he visited Vietnam, he ensured that Apple will invest further and even more into Vietnam. And I was quite surprised to find out that from 2019 to today, Apple actually invested like 19 billion US dollar into Vietnam alone, because now Vietnam is the manufacturing hub of airport and iPad for Apple. And there will be more, for future like Apple products made in Vietnam as well. Following this Tim Cook visit, it was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that they also share that they are supporting effectively, directly and indirectly, 200,000 jobs in Vietnam through their factories, but also the supply chain, the suppliers. And also sounds like they're also really focused on the CS side as well. Just reading out here, they are supporting a lot of water installation services, more than 42,000 students in Vietnam, as well as putting up together a $50 million fund to help train employees in the supply chain with vocational training. So quite a lot of
Mhm.
CSR deployment as well, which I think is always important because one of the key lessons I learned from my Harvard MBA was that the more fixed your asset is, the more immobile your asset is, the more important that you are to do CSR because
Mm.
CSR is a good way to build local partnerships and
Yeah.
honestly get credit with the local political system, right? So if you have an oil well or a giant factory, it's very hard to move it if the people don't like you and change their mind
Yeah.
about supporting you. So you want to do that early and regularly. Versus if you're an asset that's in and out, so it's very mobile, like crypto or some kind of very liquid asset, then there's not much requirement to do local CSR. So to me, the signaling here is like, hey, Apple's really doubling down, not just via the CSR, but also on investment share.
Yeah. Tim Cook also visited Singapore and promised to hire even more talents from Singapore as well.
Yeah, they promised to put in another $250 million in Singapore, fund as well. Singapore does serve as a regional quarters for the region. So I think it's understandable in terms of that. Also, a lot of your key sensitive information is also being held in Singapore. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic where everyone in Southeast Asia is getting more Apple investment effectively with the way he was touring
Yeah.
Southeast Asia. He was also in China before that, and he was also very well received. He opened up a new store, and then all the Chinese employees and customers were very happy for him. But it does feel like he's diversifying out of China into the China plus one supply chain because of the decoupling aspect as well. Interesting
Yeah.
times.
Yeah. Definitely.
So what's interesting is that there was also more Nvidia news. Obviously, Arrow is a media darling for AI chips, but I heard that they were involved in Vietnam again. Could you share a little bit more?
Yeah. Before talking about Nvidia, maybe let me start with the story about FPT, because recently I just came back to Vietnam from South Korea. FPT, they have presence in 50 different countries. in the world. And globally, they have about 30,000 employees. They have many small business lines, but the largest revenue come from FPT software. So essentially, they are like the power outsourcing house starting from Vietnam. So when you think about how can Southeast Asian company or Vietnamese company go abroad, I think FPT is like the idol or the first example on how to do it, how to achieve global scale from Vietnam presence. Last year alone, from the FPT software, they made about 1 billion in revenue and group level combined because they also have FPT retail and other service line as well. I think group level combined, they must getting about 2 billion, but the software alone is 1 billion. So the FPT Korea, they sponsor a career conference for Vietnamese students in Korea. I was quite impressed like how many Vietnamese students are actually studying in Korea. And together they hosted this career conference sponsored by FPT Korea. So I was one of the speaker and then sharing about how I started my career in VC and then why they should consider P and VC as a career. I also met with the country manager of Software Korea in Seoul. But essentially, the biggest news for FPT is their partnership. Well, they are partnering with Nvidia, and FPT will build a 200 million factory in Vietnam, and they are getting the technology from Nvidia chip, which is pretty surprising because there are a lot of demand for Nvidia chips, and even if you have money, it's not guaranteed that you are able to buy from Nvidia, but FPT got the agreement to partner with Nvidia. And if you look at the past few months or few years, FPT also invested a lot in a company in Silicon Valley. They invested strategically in Lending AI, an AI startup founded by Andrew Ng, which is another very famous AI researcher in the Bay Area. So just the fact that FPT got the approval to partner with Nvidia and build a factory in Vietnam alone is quite impressive already. And I think not a lot of people outside of Vietnam know about FPT. So that was pretty insightful to hear from the executive of PT Korea and share about what they are doing globally and also for Vietnam.
Yeah, I took the opportunity to research FPT as well before the call. And there were a few fun facts about FPT. So it was founded in 1988, and the real original meaning of FPT was Food Processing Technology Company.
Mm, yeah.
and, and so I guess they're no longer doing food processing.
Jamie, if you know Vingroup,
Yeah.
Vingroup also originated from selling noodles.
What?
Yeah. So the founders of this corporation are like the first generation of Vietnamese entrepreneurs. They all study abroad in Russia
Right.
or USSR former countries. And while studying abroad, they made a living by selling food, selling instant noodles in Ukraine, in Russia. And that's how they made their first fortune to come back to Vietnam and founded FPT or Vingroup. Yeah. So that's why the name comes from food processing technology.
That's so great. Awesome. Maybe we should do a history story time of, discuss the story of each company as well. Yeah, so it was amazing to hear that. And so a few other facts because I've honestly never heard of FPT until you mentioned it. So FPT, like you said, is making about $2 billion of revenue per year. It's currently only traded on the Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange, which is why I never heard of it ever. Its current valuation is around 6 billion USD, and 49% is owned by foreign investors. And the chairman and founder holds about 7%. So to be honest, I never heard of FPT, but it sounds very much like the Infosys for Vietnam. Can you share a little bit more about the services they provide?
Most obvious is outsourcing software development, but they also have more services offerings, such as trying to build their own semiconductor as well. In Vietnam, they are building the largest pharmacy chain, which is very interesting. So they know technology and they know retail. They also have FPT retail. So under FPT, there's FPT retail, FPT software, FPT university, which they have their own university, and many other subsidiaries. But the biggest two are FPT software, which their main service is outsourcing, and the second one is FPT retail. So they own the largest pharmacy chain in Vietnam, and they own the largest electronic retail chain in Vietnam. For example, if I want to buy a new MacBook or a new iPhone, I would go to FPT retail. Yeah, I think a lot of foreigners don't know about them.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, like myself, to be honest.
Yeah.
I'm a foreigner.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I think it's interesting because you have a lot of conglomerates in Southeast Asia that have this dynamic. And Bain recently did a report this year saying that most conglomerates don't perform as well or on the stock market as pure competitors. But it is what it is. It feels like historically companies had figured out what to build and then they wanted to build something else, and turns out nobody else was going to build it with venture capital or external capital, so they had to find their own capital. And it turns out the capital comes from their first business, and then they use that money to invest in second business, and then it gets up to scale. Then they use the money from two businesses to build up a third. So almost every business has a conglomerate in Southeast Asia. Right? There are actually relatively fewer pure play, unless you are a next second gen or third gen founder.
But it's really the best example of how a Vietnamese company can expand globally because they have presence in 50 different countries.
Is there like a business wisdom book of FPT or something?
I think there is. I will try to find. And
Yeah.
interestingly, when I talked to the country manager in Korea, he's also doing new business development in Mongolia.
Oh.
So they don't have a presence in Mongolia, but they are going there to understand the market and entering the market in the near future. So if there's a playbook, I will let you know. But it's amazing how not many foreigners know about FPT, but they all know about Vim.
Yeah, that reminds me of my recent trip because I was in Bangkok for the Huawei APEC Congress. So quite a lot of similarities, a conglomerate, but also very much in tech. It does feel like one difference that Huawei is much more focused on manufacturing side, and this very much feels a little bit less on the hardware side. So yeah, lots of fun companies in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, right now, FPT is mostly focusing on software because software is, like I mentioned, 50% of their group revenue. But I can see in the future, the partnership with Nvidia will open up a lot of doors to their future hardware business. That's just my guess.
Ooh, you're gonna say that the Vietnamese and Chinese are gonna fight?
No, no. We are Vietnamese. We don't fight with anyone.
There was the
Yeah.
French, the Americans, and the
Yeah.
Chinese multiple times.
We just protect our country. Like we protect our independence and our freedom if necessary, but we don't fight.
Oh, I like that. I like that. We should write this on a
Yeah.
banner somewhere.
Yeah, we just do everything to protect our freedom and independence.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I heard that in Vietnam, every student has to learn how to assemble and disassemble an AK-47.
Yeah, correct. I did that.
You did that?
Yeah.
So what was that like?
So always fun because you don't have to do academic for a week straight. And for a week straight, you just learn how to assemble the AK-47 and kind of acting like you are in military. So regardless of whether you are guy or girl, you get to skip all the academic and just have fun for a week. And also, I want to emphasize the first day we go to school as a 6-year-old child, the first thing we were taught is nothing is as important as our country independence and freedom. That's the first thing that we were taught. So that's why we have this 1 week long of military training, even though we are still in high school.
Wow, amazing. That's definitely true. I mean, if I had
Yeah.
gone through what Vietnam had gone through as a country, I would have every kid learn how to go
Yeah.
through that 1 week of class. Singapore has that as well. I mean, with Total Defense Day. So it's on the day that Singapore fell to the Japanese, even though the British Empire was supposedly defending its crown colony. So Singapore marks that anniversary with a Total Defense Day. So every child, every student has to go through this whole process where they learn about all the different pillars. Maybe not assembling and disassembling an AK-47, but yeah, a lot of them will go to an army base or see a bunch of stuff and all those things. The wars were not that long ago, to be honest. It's
Yeah.
honestly only one generation ago.
And actually, we just celebrate our reunification day, and we have a long holiday for that. So history was really recent.
Yeah. I think interesting fact is that the Vietnam War was a huge boost to Singapore's GDP back then because of the whole Vietnam War. So Singapore was part of the whole supply chain for I would say the British and the US side. So a lot of trade was going through Singapore and pushing a lot of advancement up the semiconductor and the manufacturing value chain for Singapore. Quite interesting. So when you think about Vietnam, and obviously there's a lot of this investment and all these trends, anything that's around the radar for the next month or quarter from your perspective? Hey, remember you're talking about like there's a Congress coming up, any events?
Yeah, this year it's still going to be quite volatile for internal politics. But again, this is very short-term volatility on not necessarily long-term pain. If anything, it clears up for long-term transparency. And yeah, the former chief parliament, he just visited China and then kind of shake hands with Xi Jinping and guarantee a new high-speed railway with China from Vietnam. And the construction will be done before 2030. So there's a lot of innovation in infrastructure in Vietnam. And there's also a lot of new development in terms of American companies coming into Vietnam and promise to invest in the country. So I don't have the crystal ball for telling the future, but there's no reason for be gloomy and be negative about the country just because there's some hit in the internal politics.
Yeah, definitely two aspects. One, of course, is the Belt and Road Initiative as well as the short-term hiccups. For the hiccup side, at the end of the day, all the problems were over the past 10, 20 years, right? I mean, like fraud on the bank side was happening for quite some time. So I think the real issue was then, and now that it's come to light, it's good that it's getting cleaned up and that the message is being sent. So yeah, like you said, people are very gloomy now. But it's almost like inverted, which is everybody kind of knew this was happening in the past, but everyone's letting
Yeah.
it slide. And then now people should be happy that it's getting fixed because it's worse if we let it continue, but definitely some short-term pain.
Correct. Yeah. I would be looking at what FPT is shaking hand with Nvidia. I would looking at Apple is even lifting up further investment into Vietnam. I would look at Vietnam-China collaboration rather than negative movement in the internal politics.
Let's just see. I mean, the thing is, I think what people hope is that it settles down. So let's see how after
Yeah.
the extraordinary general meeting, let's see what happens and hopefully it stabilizes from there. It's quite interesting for the highway thing because China continues to do the investments in infrastructure, right? So we discussed the Funan Techno Canal for the Cambodia side. They're also doing a Thailand infrastructure investment as well. And now they're also doing the Vietnam side as well. And they also did the high-speed rail for Indonesia as well.
They did? Yeah, I didn't know that. But for Vietnam, there will be 2 new railway from Hanoi to Yunnan province and from Hanoi to Guangxi province. And there's also talk of high-speed railway from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City because currently there's one, but the railway was built by the French 100 years ago. I think it would take a week from from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City if I take the current system. So with the new technology and the railway from China, maybe it would only take a few hours. That would be ideal.
Yeah, it only feels like a few hours because in terms of distance, high-speed rail is fast. But yeah,
Yep.
I didn't know it would take a week for the current train system.
Yes, because they make a lot of stops in between. And it's an old infrastructure from the French colonization time.
Yeah, that would be a fun railway. You know what? That would be fun to do. We should do a railway ride on the old approach, and then you should do it again here at high speed. The high speed one would be very romantic, no? The whole idea of this.
I don't want to do the old railway.
It's only all the hippie California backpackers want to do it.
Yes.
Old
Yeah.
school.
Jamie, you're welcome to take it. I'm good.
Yeah, you're good. I will take my
Yeah,
Instagram
no.
photos and put it on my
No.
Instagram story.
I will pass.
It'll be fast. Yeah, there you go. On that note, thank you so much for sharing, Valerie.
Thank you, Jeremy. Happy to catch up what's happening in Vietnam the past month.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.